It began not in daylight, but in the flicker of torches that trembled against the marble walls of Rome's palaces, where the air smelled of wine, sweat, and rose oil, and where power and pleasure were never far apart. In the empire's highest chambers, far from the noise of the forum and the cries of the poor, there existed a hidden world, a world built on silence and shadows, where boys became ornaments and innocence was currency. They were called deliciae, the delights, a name that captured both their beauty and their curse. Some were born free, taken from distant provinces along the empire's edge, from the hills of Gaul, the coasts of Greece, the markets of Syria. Others were born already bound, their mothers selling them to traders for a handful of coins, never knowing they were selling them to the gods of the empire's lust. When they arrived in Rome, they were washed, perfumed, renamed. Their old lives were stripped from them like dirty garments. They learned quickly that the key to survival was obedience and beauty. Tutors trained them not in reading or writing, but in movement, in the delicate art of existing only to please. They learned to lower their eyes when spoken to smile without showing need, to respond with grace even when their hearts burned with fear. In the emperor's palace, there was no greater sin than to remind a master that one's body housed a soul. These boys were the empire's most fragile secret, the living evidence of its decadence, and yet they moved through its corridors like ghosts unseen by the world outside. During feasts, they stood silently behind couches draped in silk, fanning noblemen as musicians played lyres and flutes. The air shimmered with laughter, but it was a laughter born of intoxication and indulgence. The same senators who preached virtue in public would, in private, whisper to their slaves with trembling hands. And the emperor, the man who was called divine, sat at the center of it all, surrounded by his chosen favorites. To serve him was both an honor and a death sentence. His gaze could lift a boy into luxury or crush him into nothingness. Each night, the palace came alive with the soft sound of sandals on marble and the rustle of silk. An invisible procession of boys being led to chambers where politics and passion shared the same bed. Some emperors sought companionship, others sought control. Caligula, they whispered, filled his palace with beauty simply because he could, because to own what others desired made him feel eternal. Nero, more dangerous still, believed himself both artist and god. He did not see his concubines as slaves, but as extensions of his fantasies, living instruments for the theater of his mind. Among them was Sporus, a boy whose fate would forever stain the empire's conscience. Nero loved him because he reminded him of his dead wife, Poppaea. But love in Nero's world was not tenderness. It was possession. He ordered Sporus to be castrated, dressed him in silk, adorned him with jewels, and called him Sabina, Poppaea's name. The court watched in silence as the emperor married the boy in a public ceremony, the people cheering, the priests pretending the gods approved. Rome's streets echoed with rumors, but in the palace the boy's cries went unheard. To Nero, it was devotion. To Sporus, it was death in slow motion. Yet his story was not unique. Across centuries, emperors and elites repeated the same pattern, the same cruelty disguised as affection. Hadrian, beloved by historians for his wisdom and architecture, found his own tragic reflection in a youth named Antinous. Unlike Nero's madness, Hadrian's love carried melancholy. When Antinous drowned in the Nile under mysterious circumstances, Hadrian deified him, building temples and statues across the empire, turning a mortal boy into a god. But even this act of devotion was possession, the final act of ownership over a life no longer free. The Romans worshipped Antinous not as a person, but as an idea, beauty, youth, perfection. No one asked whether the boy had ever wanted such immortality. The empire did not ask questions. It only collected trophies. For the boys who survived, the palace was a prison gilded with luxury. Their beds were covered with purple linen, their meals laced with honey and figs, their bodies adorned with gold chains. Yet their souls lived in darkness. They were forbidden to leave, forbidden to age, forbidden even to dream of freedom. Some turned to art for solace. A few sang softly to themselves at night, humming songs from homelands they could barely remember. Others found companionship in whispers, quiet conversations shared between stolen glances, small gestures of rebellion that no master could see. They spoke of rivers, of stars, of families left behind, of the sound of their names before Rome renamed them. Those memories were their only act of defiance, for to remember one's past was to declare silently that one was still human, but memory was also dangerous. Many erased themselves willingly, choosing numbness over pain. Their eyes became mirrors, reflecting the desires of others while hiding their own emptiness. The emperor's guards and attendants ensured that silence remained absolute. Even within the palace walls, no one dared speak of what happened in the private chambers. The empire built its legends on victory and conquest, not on the bodies that made its rulers immortal. When historians wrote of Augustus, Tiberius, or Domitian, they recorded the wars, the laws, the temples, but not the boys who shared their beds. And yet, if you look closely, traces remain. Ancient letters mention unnamed favorites who held secret influence, who could whisper into the emperor's ear and alter the fate of nations. Poets wrote of love affairs between men and boys with language so delicate it escaped censure. Artists painted frescoes of young figures reclining beside gods, their expressions serene yet sorrowful. These were not fantasies. They were confessions carved in pigment and stone. Beneath Rome's grandeur beat a heart consumed by contradictions, the worship of beauty and the destruction of innocence, the pursuit of glory and the surrender to lust. The city that built aqueducts and laws also built cages, cages lined with velvet, and those cages were filled with laughter, music, and the sound of breaking hearts. The boys who lived within them learned that Rome's love was conditional. It adored them while they were perfect, then discarded them the moment youth began to fade. A wrinkle, a scar, a change in voice. These were death sentences. Some were sold to lesser nobles, some made servants, others vanished entirely. A few, desperate to escape, ended their own lives, throwing themselves into the Tiber under moonlight, their bodies carried silently past the very palaces that had destroyed them. The empire called this decadence. History calls it tragedy. But to those who endured it, it was simply survival. The longer they lived, the more they learned to disappear, to blend into walls, to smile when commanded, to speak only in tones that pleased the ear. They became experts in the art of being invisible. Yet invisibility came at a cost. Over time, many forgot who they once were. They forgot their languages, their gods, their mothers' faces. They became shadows of Rome itself, magnificent on the surface, hollow within. And when the empire began to crumble, when its marble cracked and its emperors fell, These boys' stories crumbled too. No tombs were built for them. No poets sang their names. But their ghosts remained. Even now, when you walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill or the broken halls of Domus Aurea, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear them. The faint rustle of silk, the echo of footsteps, the soft breath of someone waiting in the dark. It is said that the walls remember everything, and if that is true, then Rome's walls remember more sorrow than triumph. They remember the laughter that hid pain, the perfume that masked fear, the torchlight that fell on trembling hands. They remember boys who were told they were beautiful, only to learn that beauty was a curse. They remember the touch of emperors who mistook ownership for love. They remember the nights when silence screamed louder than music. And they remember that even in the empire of the gods, it was mortals, fragile, frightened mortals, who paid the price for divine desire. For centuries, the story of Rome has been told as a tale of power, glory, and genius. But beneath every victory parade and marble statue lies another Rome, a Rome built on bodies that were never meant to be remembered. The concubines of the imperial palaces were its quietest victims and its most faithful witnesses. They saw the empire at its most human and its most monstrous. And though history has tried to forget them, their silence endures like an unfinished song. Because, in the end, what survives of Rome is not its gold or its gods, but the echo of those who were forced to serve both. And perhaps that is the empire's true legacy, not the rise and fall of emperors, but the endurance of those who were never allowed to rise at all. For the greatest ruins are not made of stone, they are made of memory. And memory, unlike marble, never crumbles completely. It lingers, soft, haunting, and alive, waiting for someone to listen. As the centuries unfolded, the secret world within Rome's marble heart began to shift, yet its shadow never truly vanished. When one emperor fell, another rose, and with each new reign came new appetites wrapped in old habits. The palaces changed, the frescoes faded, but the rituals of desire endured. The empire's greatness had always depended on conquest. And what is conquest, if not the belief that one's will is the only law? The boys of the imperial courts were not conquered by swords, but by gazes, not enslaved in chains, but in silks. They were taken not from battlefields, but from beauty itself, proof that the empire's hunger reached even into innocence. By the time Domitian ruled, Rome had become addicted to spectacle. The arenas roared with blood by day, and the palaces whispered with sin by night. The same crowds who cheered a gladiator's death would gossip about the emperor's newest delicacies with equal passion. Entertainment and exploitation became the twin pillars of Rome's soul. The boys, who once trembled in private chambers, were now paraded at feasts like exotic treasures. Guests would praise their youth as they praised the wine, admiring both for their flavor, never for their suffering. In this theater of decadence, even cruelty was refined into art. The emperors justified their indulgence as divine privilege. The poets romanticized it as beauty's triumph. And the victims learned to survive by becoming the illusion themselves. Some concubines mastered this art so perfectly that history mistook them for willing lovers. They danced through danger with smiles carved from fear, their every gesture calculated, their every breath a performance. Yet behind the gold and glory, Rome was rotting. Its wealth had become its poison. The senators plotted, the people starved, the gods grew silent. While emperors worshipped youth in candlelit chambers, The empire's borders began to crumble under the weight of neglect. Armies deserted, roads decayed, and faith, once Rome's sharpest weapon, dissolved into apathy. Still, inside those perfumed rooms, the games continued. The boys were taught that love was obedience, that touch was destiny. They learned to read the language of survival, the angle of a master's smile, the pause before a command, the difference between mercy and boredom. Some rose to influence, whispering advice into imperial ears. Others became invisible, fading from memory before their voices had even deepened. The empire had perfected the art of forgetting. It forgot its slaves, its soldiers, its promises, and it forgot the children it consumed in silence. When Constantine embraced Christianity centuries later, Rome tried to wash itself clean. The new faith condemned the excesses of the old gods, but it did not erase them. It merely changed their names. The temples became churches, the rituals turned sacred, but the hunger beneath remained the same. The chronicles of the saints spoke of purity, yet the monasteries echoed with their own quiet secrets. Sin simply learned to kneel, and the ghosts of the imperial boys drifted on unseen, their memories stitched into the fabric of every city that rose on Rome's bones. For they were not just victims of a single empire, they were symbols of what power always does when it loses its conscience. Even as the Western Empire fell, their stories survived in whispers. Greek scholars spoke of them as cautionary myths. Medieval scribes turned them into allegories of temptation. Pain became poetry. Tragedy became lesson. But no one ever gave them back their names. In every age that followed, empires repeated Rome's sin, gilding cruelty with culture, calling domination love, and sacrificing the powerless for pleasure. In the courts of Byzantium, in the harems of the East, in the brothels of Renaissance Venice, the pattern continued. The powerful desired what was pure and destroyed it to prove control. The faces changed, the tongues changed, but the eyes remained the same. Those eyes that once watched Rome burn while its rulers toasted beauty's corpse. Yet, in the ruins, something extraordinary happened. The art that once glorified oppression began to betray it. Sculptors unknowingly carved sorrow into marble smiles. Pain leaked through perfection. In paintings of youthful gods and angels, one can still sense a hidden grief, the memory of boys who once stood where marble now stands. Even stone remembers. And as time marched forward, historians tried to dig through the ashes of empire, searching for truth beneath the propaganda. They found inscriptions half erased, names struck out with deliberate care, fragments of letters written by noblemen who spoke of companions of the night. They found jewelry too delicate for soldiers, combs carved from ivory that could only have belonged to those who once brushed the hair of emperors. They found silence, the loudest evidence of all. For every record that survived, dozens had been destroyed, every erasure an admission of guilt. The Roman historians who chronicled wars and triumphs wrote nothing of these boys, not because they did not know, but because they dared not. History, after all, is written by those who wish to look innocent in eternity's eyes. But time has a cruel honesty. As archaeologists unearthed mosaics and frescoes from beneath volcanic ash and palace dust, the truth began to breathe again. The painted figures, once mistaken for myth, revealed something human: tenderness, fear, the brief ache of unwanted touch. Rome's gods, it seemed, were not gods at all, but masks worn by men afraid of mortality. and the boys who served them were the price of that fear. Yet within that suffering lay something indestructible, a quiet defiance that refused to vanish. You can feel it still when you walk through the ruins at dusk, when the last light bleeds over the Colosseum and the wind sighs through the arches. It is not the wind, it is remembrance. The empire that called itself eternal is dust, but its forgotten children live on in the imagination of those who dare to listen. For they were the secret witnesses of civilization, the ones who saw beauty and brutality hold hands, who knew that even gods could tremble when confronted with the innocence they destroyed. Their silence became history's conscience. In that silence lies the echo of every question humanity still struggles to answer. What is power without empathy? What is love without freedom? How many empires must rise and fall before we learn that possession is not affection? The story of Rome's concubines is not ancient. It is eternal, repeating in every age that worships youth and discards humanity. It lives in every glittering palace built on quiet suffering, in every system that trades dignity for desire. The names change, kings, presidents, idols, but the pattern is always Rome's. And yet, perhaps redemption begins with remembrance. For when we remember, we undo the erasure. We give the nameless back their voices. Imagine for a moment one of those boys, no longer trembling, no longer enslaved. Imagine him standing among the ruins of the palace where he once served, the marble cracked, the gold dust turned to dirt. The empire that owned him is gone, its banners eaten by time. The statues that once watched him in silence now crumble at his feet. He breathes freely for the first time in eternity. Around him, the air is thick with ghosts, but the ghosts no longer frighten him. They are simply witnesses to his becoming. He walks through the halls where emperors once whispered commands, and he whispers back softly, "I remember." It is not revenge, it is resurrection. In that single act of memory, he breaks the curse of silence that Rome built around him. He becomes not a victim, but a storyteller. His voice, though centuries late, carries farther than the roar of any emperor's army. It crosses oceans, cultures, and ages, reminding all who listen that power fades, but truth endures, that every empire is, at its core, a fragile illusion, and that the most dangerous illusions are the ones gilded in beauty. For beauty without mercy becomes cruelty, and cruelty without memory becomes history. But memory, once awakened, is unstoppable. It crawls through ruins, hides in songs, waits in the breath of poets and the dreams of filmmakers whispering, "Tell it again." Tell the story of those who could not tell their own. Tell it not to shame, but to understand. For Rome's concubines were not only victims of lust, they were casualties of a civilization that mistook desire for divinity. Their story is the mirror we hold up to ourselves, and what we see reflected there decides whether we have truly evolved or merely learned to sin in silence. And so, the tale ends where it began, in whispers. But these whispers no longer belong to the emperors. They belong to the boys, the ones who were erased. They rise from the stones, from the dust, from the echoes of laughter that once filled the golden halls, and they speak to us across time. We were here. We were human. And though the empire tried to forget, memory never dies. The wind moves through the ruins like breath through a sleeping god, carrying their voices beyond the Tiber, beyond Rome, into the heart of every listener, and somewhere between shadow and light, between history and eternity, the empire that once enslaved them finally bows, not to power, not to glory, but to truth.